Well, good morning and good afternoon to everyone who's tuned in around the world. Welcome to the EFT by Reuters events supply chain risk series of virtual roundtables. My name is Paddy LeCount. I'm the project director here at EFT by Reuters events. And today we're discussing the impact of increasing e-commerce and delivering customer expectations during and beyond COVID-19. So thank you all for joining. Now we want to make this a fairly interactive discussion, so please do send in your questions to our panel of experts at today's roundtable, and we'll endeavour to answer those a bit later in the hour. You can submit your questions via the question function on the software that will be presenting this to you now. Now, joining us today are four industry leaders from across the supply chain ecosystem, and they'll be sharing their thoughts on this topic. They are Markus Reckling, Managing Director of DHL Express Germany, Jamin Dick, Head of the North American Supply Chain for Alibaba, Roman Sobieri, Head of Global Shipping from Etsy, and Roy Anderson, Chief Procurement and Digital Transformation Officer at Tradeshift. Now, gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. I think probably the most prudent way to start this is for a quick introduction from yourselves to the audience, and then we'll get into some questions. So if we start with yourself, Markus. It doesn't seem that we've actually can hear Markus at the moment, so apologies for that. Well, we quickly sort that one out.
Here we go again. Now you should be able to hear me.
There you are.
So hello again. I said, excuse the bad haircut. I'm desperately waiting for the hairdressers to open again, which is going to be this week in Germany. So besides that, I'm working for Deutsche Post DHL since 20 years already. Since 2017 as the head of the German DHL Express business. Before that, I was actually in charge of the Turkish business. And before that, I had several corporate roles within Deutsche Post DHL group. That should be enough, I guess, for the moment.
Excellent. Jamin, if you'd like to continue.
Sure. I'm Jamin Dick, and I lead supply chain for North America Alibaba. And my team and I, we help small and medium businesses conduct trade all over the world. And that includes things like air, ocean, land, customs clearance, and anything else that they need help with. So I've been at Alibaba now for a year and a half, and it's been growing and quite an exciting ride.
Brilliant. Roman, yourself?
Sure. So I'm Roman Sobieri, and I'm head of global shipping at Etsy. And for those of you who don't know, ask your wives or girlfriends. I'm sure they're going to say, "Oh, I love Etsy." We're a two-sided marketplace based out of Brooklyn with about $5 billion in sales, and our focus is handcrafted products. So we're really selling and have sellers in every country in the world with 3 million sellers and about 50 million buyers all over the place. So it's really an everywhere to everywhere model. What's kind of interesting about Etsy is that 86% of our sellers are women and 95% of our sellers actually work from their own homes. So I started, my career as an aerospace engineer, but really got hooked into disruptive technologies and worked for Fujifilm and companies called Border Free, Pitney Bowes, and been with Etsy for a little over 3 years now.
Perfect. And last but by no means least, Roy, a bit about yourself.
Hi, Roy Anderson here. I'm the Chief Procurement and Digital Transformation Officer for Tradeshift. I started my career way back in the last century working with military and commercial manufacturing in the supply chain with a company called Raytheon, and then moved into space-based procurement at Textron and the Millstar programs, and then had the opportunity of joining in the procurement function of Fidelity Investments, building out their procurement operation, doing homegrown source-to-pay solutions. And then became the CPO at companies like John Hancock as they went public, CPO at MetLife as they went global, putting in technologies, spent some time at State Street as their CPO, ran a company that did tailspin management, and then joined 2 years ago Tradeshift because I saw them as the future of network supply chain capability.
Perfect. Thank you very much for those quick intros there. So as I mentioned, please do ask your questions to the panel. as we go through the hour. But I will kick things off with a question that is fairly broad, but that should give you plenty of scope to come around to it. So, to what extent do you expect long-term customer behavior to change, or rather to change in the long term as a result of the COVID-19 outbreak, and how maybe that will affect the way that either B2B or B2C consumers expect to buy and receive products in that good old phrase now, the new normal? Jamin, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Yeah, it's a great question. I think to some extent the trends that we're already seeing around free and fast delivery will just be enhanced. I think customer expectations are really evolving all the time, and the current pandemic, I think, has just accelerated this. In recent years, B2C purchasing has really significantly evolved. Customers have come to expect more from their B2B purchases, which is the business that we're in, as they do from their B2C purchases. They expect transparency and reliability, and they want to make purchases online. They want to be able to track those shipments and have them delivered quickly. So we do see B2C trends sort of weighing into the B2B world. One thing that's interesting, UPS does a study every couple of years, which looks at buying trends in the B2B world. And this past year, they focused on generational dynamics driving change in this area. And one of the quotes I found really interesting was where they said, buyers are sourcing internationally. They value shipping solutions that reduce cross-border complexity and support problem-free customs entry and quick delivery. And they were surmising that this is likely resulting from consumer trends that millennials experience in their personal lives, marked by easy-to-use technology and seamless online transactions. And what's interesting to me is that I think we've traditionally thought of millennials as newcomers to the business world, and I think we have to update that, because they are not the newcomers. They are managing business. They are actually running the business in many cases, and so what they're doing is bringing their preferences that they grew up with into the business world, and we're seeing that they're changing how many small businesses are operating. And I think this is even more true during COVID-19, where conducting trade from home is now a requirement. So digitization of ordering and B2B in particular, it's already a huge trend, but I think the expectation is that we're going to see more digitization of that and more adoption of platforms that can facilitate that.
Excellent. And Roy, your thoughts, I suppose, on a slightly more technical side of things there.
So the key element to this area is that people are very dynamic, and they end up forgetting. So they've had pandemics and disasters in the past, and individuals will start to move towards opportunities that make it easy for them to get their business done. I believe that the changes that have to occur based on going deep in the supply chain. Enormous amount of visibility. People are going to want to know where their food's coming from, where their products are coming from, and what actually drives better decision making based upon this pandemic. People started to realize that things like PPE shortages and supply chains can be diverted and adjusted, causing problems around the world. So I think the consumer is going to learn a lot about this process. They're going to understand that there is a supply chain involved, and that they're going to want to know more about that, which also includes things like sustainability and safety in that process.
Yeah, certainly. And I suppose with consumer profiles and requirements have changed a lot, as we've touched on there, during this period of lockdown for many regions, and whatever that looks like for anyone out there. But from what position, and I'll come to Markus first and then Roman, from your position in the e-commerce ecosystem, if you like, how has your company adapted to these shifts, and what's been the biggest challenge to delivering continued customer satisfaction at this time?
Well, of course, I mean, during the pandemic, of course, health and safety is of a predominant challenge in these times, and that's of course where our first and foremost focus in that was making sure that well knowing that in the e-commerce ecosystem we are kind of the most visible face of our customers to their customers. So we need to really make sure that face is the face they want to have, and in that sense, health and safety was a key requirement. So keep making sure the whole process is safe. So topics that we heavily focused on, first of all, is of course contactless deliveries. Make sure you have a proper way of getting the stuff in front of your customer, and especially for DHL Express, where we're talking mainly international shipments, mainly high value goods, having a contactless delivery option, which is nevertheless safe and documents very well what has happened and not just throwing something over a fence. That was a huge effort. Together with keeping our couriers safe altogether, which was also a key requirement. Masks, the disinfectants, giving them an opportunity to wash their hands whilst they're on the route to keep our customers safe. So we've put little water tanks in all the vehicles and similar things like that. Then another key option is what we call ODD. So that already leads to a bit of a digitization discussion. On-demand delivery, really giving the consumer the option to receive the shipment in whichever way he or she wants, leave it at a neighbor, do this, do that with it. We found that this solution has become way more popular during the crisis than normal times, and it exactly gives us the flexibility and safety to do so. And then, of course, a big issue was the demand shifts that we see during the crisis and adapting to those. As you know, roughly 50% of the cargo in the world is flying on passenger aircraft. All passenger aircraft currently is not flying. So there was a huge shortage on certain lanes, especially from Asia to Europe is a key shortage. So really upscaling our capabilities there to really keep those flow of goods moving and keep, maybe with a few extra days, but keep the customer promise going was an extraordinary effort. And now, for the full month of April, for example, DHL Express was the busiest airline in all of Europe with the most flights per day of all the airlines that were flying in the European skies, because we really upscaled our own efforts. We have the luxury of having own cargo airplanes, but even that we needed to upscale. That was a huge challenge. So, and we're really facing sizable extra costs just for that. Not even talking about having to put pilots into private airplanes because they can't sleep at the airport because otherwise they would be in quarantine, things like that. And then other topics is of course things like paperless trade, so keeping customs documents digital and by that contactless. And since we're very much in the international business, next to what I've already talked about, ADD, also the cash collection at the door. We've stopped our COD product, our cash on delivery product, to keep the consumer and to keep our drivers safe. But for duties charges, we introduced a new electronic way where basically prior to receiving the shipment, the consumer can pay via PayPal or other solutions online and then receive the shipments without any duties attached to them. And things like that have been the big challenge that we've been facing.
And Roman, for yourself on that point.
Sure. Well, with Etsy, as indicated, we're a highly dispersed marketplace. And that's actually served us extremely well during this situation because most of our sellers are working from home. So, we don't have concentrated locations where, sellers have to go into a place of business. They're quarantined at their workplace. Which is great in that regard. So as long as the carriers are still running, they can still deliver their products. So that's I think gives us really great ability to continue offering the products. Secondly is just the nimbleness of our sellers. I think has been really fantastic. We put out a big request for our sellers that the world needs masks. And we have a lot of talented craft people on there. And so thousands upon thousands of our sellers started shifting from maybe making apparel or hair bands to making masks, and have created literally millions of masks for consumers out there. So that's, I think, been really successful in a lot of ways. But as far as the consumer behavior, well, anything that relates to gatherings. I mean, now's not a good time to get married, and we obviously had a lot of business supporting weddings and events and gatherings. So the shift has been more towards gift-based behaviors. People still want to celebrate, but they have to do it from a distance. So what can they do to make an event special and have that sent to the family members or friends? So as far as challenges go, I think Markus kind of called out a lot of them for me, because it really is about delivery. And there's, being a global company, the borders are very challenged. And I think what we've seen is I think B.F. Skinner, when he did his studies about human behavior, when you get used to something consistent and dependable, the minute that it breaks down, then suddenly your trust is broken. And I think that holds true for on-time deliveries. It holds true for tracking. And I know the carriers right now are really preferring to get a product delivered over maintaining perfect tracking. They're using alternative locations. I've seen even USPS has commissioned a bunch of large freighter ships. They're up to 2 of them now to get products over to Europe, which is obviously a much more delayed route than the flights that they've been using. And although the items will eventually get there, forget about tracking. That's pretty much out the window. But also, add on another at least 10 days onto the process. So trying to reassure the buyers that the items are still arriving, they're still coming, and even though they're used to water coming out of their faucet every time they turn their knob, that's not the world we're in right now. And they just need to be a little more patient. And that's going to take a while for consumers to get used to the fact that that trust is going to be rebuilt once things do eventually go back to whatever the new normal is in that regards.
Sure. And I suppose actually, so leading on from there, as we've discussed, understanding customers at any time is important. Right now, it's crucial to maintaining that relationship. And I suppose I'll jump to Roy now. How do you think, how is your organization, how do you think other organizations need to be looking to stay in touch with either business customers or end consumers at this time to keep that value and keep that understanding level high, and making sure the dialogue is there and the communication doesn't fall down?
Well, it's obviously important for everyone to keep transparency in their process. In the supply chain, I tend to spend my time on finding out how we can actually build out the end tier supply chain. So Tradeshift, for example, is a network. In its network, we're connecting suppliers to suppliers to suppliers, so that you can now have documents flowing all the way down to the origination point, and then out to, in the ultimate state, out to the consumer. So we can actually improve the whole concept of a digital footprint of a physical supply chain. So think of the possibilities associated with all the data that's collected at each step of the process. So that includes everything from your inspection data to your shipping activity, to what's happening on the trucks as they go around the country and on the freighters, and then be able to work through the incoming inspection areas all the way up to final assembly, and then ultimately to the end consumer. So we were talking to one large client about how they wanted to be able to build that entire transparent flow. They call it a digital footprint on a physical chain. And then on top of that, be able to add in a digital currency structure. So what I'm looking for and what I'm driving in terms of communicating between customers and suppliers is how we can better use blockchain in that entire structure, so that you can have a air traffic controller view of your entire supply chain. And then the communication is driven through AI and machine learning, and be able to give you better information about that entire string. that level of transparency is going to radically change the way communication is done up and down the supply chain. And I think will allow us to be able to create something that is now going around as an anti-fragile supply chain, a supply chain that has real-time data that can manipulate the flows, find new pathways, be able to provide more opportunity. I think that Roman's comment on Etsy is having these local suppliers actually switch their production to PPE products is exactly the type of anti-fragile structure that will allow the organizations of the future to be able to handle pandemics in a whole different way. I think that's the level of communication that's going to be driven.
Sure. And Jamin, your aspects of communication with customers and partners alike.
Yeah, this is actually a really, this is probably my favorite part of my job, is talking to customers. You know, Alibaba is committed to providing our customers with small businesses with knowledge and resources and tips that they need to navigate either the current challenges from COVID-19 or just their business in general. In January, we launched something called B2b Tuesday, which is an awareness and educational initiative that helps us spotlight small businesses, let them tell their stories, and kind of collaborate with other small businesses to talk about how to either engage in global trade more effectively or just share stories with each other. You know, these small businesses, we think, drive not just the US economy, but the global economy. So it couldn't be more important for us to listen to them. And so, in fact, it's so important that we actually require all of our employees to talk to customers for several hours per month and bring back what they're learning from them. So one thing that we've been doing in these interactions is talking to them about pivot stories, and similar to what Roman was mentioning, talking to them about how they can contribute to the healthcare efforts with COVID-19 or just to stay afloat right now. And to amplify this, we're working with other like-minded organizations and influencers to tell their stories more publicly and to give them a little bit of marketing lift. But so that's the biggest thing that we do, I think, is just talking to customers and hearing from them. And for me, it's important because it brings immediate focus to what we're doing. It helps us sort out the things that are less important to our customers and focus our energy on what they need most. But overall, you know, Alibaba is dedicated to helping small and medium businesses either navigating COVID-19 crisis or just in the recovery phase. How can they grow their businesses and expand them and reach international customers?
Perfect. And Markus, your thoughts on that?
Yes, happy to share. Of course, you know, at first, you know, I have a large number of people doing nothing else than driving all across Germany the entire day visiting customers. So we were like, what are we going to do now? But we quickly realized that how crucial this communication to customers is at the moment. So what we started out doing is, and I can only encourage everybody, we really created very quickly training sessions. You know, now when you're not in front of the customer but on the phone, what do you do different? What are topics? We created conversation cards, topics of the week that we were talking to customers about, be it about e-commerce, be it about the COVID crisis itself, be it about a ton of other topics. And, you know, 2 weeks ago, we did a large, what we call sales blitz. So the entire sales force was actually on the phone the whole day. We did a total, I think, of close to 6,000 phone calls in one day. And for us, that was a great temperature check, you know, how much the customers appreciate us talking to them, because we're a bit nervous. Don't they have other problems? Do they really want to talk to us? No, but I think the supply chain transportation is on the top of everybody's mind, and resilience of the supply chain is on the top of everybody's mind. So there's a lot of conversation you can do. There's a lot of topics the customers really, really appreciate. We also created a webinar for our e-commerce customers. What's important if you're an e-commerce shop now in the COVID-19 crisis? What do you need to change on your website and things like that? We have dedicated microsites about it. Our emailing campaigns are suddenly much more successful than they were in the past, which much bigger opening rates and with much bigger response rates. And of course, we're getting much more daring and courageous on social media. and using that also for staying in touch. So there's a multitude of opportunities that we can do here, and we are so far very, very happy with that. And we even, we created this little campaign, which was originally planned as an internal campaign, Double Tap for Pride, where people were supposed to do like this and they thank you to the couriers out there on the street delivering. But that quickly even spread from an internal campaign into an external campaign, where suddenly actually our customers were greeting their couriers with that. So I think this, the more distant you are, the more communication is needed. And that's true for internal communication as well as for communication with your customers. So be daring, I think, don't get frustrated about, not being able to visit customers. There's a multitude of value you can add from the distance as well.
Yes, exactly. Now, thank you very much for those of you who sent in your questions already. There's a common thread in the questions that have been coming through, which we can address now, and that's sort of on the issue of where e-commerce has always been a trend on the rise, and certainly that's been expedited hugely in the last few months. But with more e-commerce, be it B2B or B2C, that means more deliveries. Now, for the panel, and maybe we can start with Roman again, what impact will this have on wider industry issues, specifically coming through on the comments, the issues of capacity requirements or even sustainability initiatives, and what needs to be done maybe to mitigate these as we say, we've expedited this conversation by a number of months, possibly even a year, to the levels we're at now.
Sure, and that's very valid. I mean, obviously, we've seen the shift from a more retail in presence to smaller footprints. I think this is just accelerating that, and that just means that delivery will have to have wider capacities to support that. So, that's inevitable, and I think we just saw an acceleration of it. I think from a buyer behavior standpoint, I think what we're seeing now is, moving from early adopters to what I call compelled adopters. This is kind of a new category where you adopt a new technology not because you want to, but because you kind of have to. And seeing a lot of people who are uncomfortable with online now having to order and have stuff delivered to their homes. It's like supermarket deliveries, things like that. So that obviously is going to create some bottlenecks and change in the economy. Hopefully, it'll right-side itself soon with jobs and facilities that support that. From sustainability, that I think is a subject near and dear to my organization's core values. And we're one of the first e-com players that actually took 100% responsibility for our carbon offset for all of our shipping. And so, we take that, as part of our core values that we need to support. And so, having good sustainability and reducing your impact generally comes down to the four fundamentals. First, it's eliminating unnecessary movement. Moving stuff around when you don't have to, point to point. I mean, it's also good business. I'm sure Markus spends a tremendous amount of his time trying to figure out how not to drive that same truck back and forth down the street, or Lord forbid, multiple deliveries. But the vehicles themselves. What are the new vehicles? USPS right now is due to make a decision about their new aging fleet of trucks that they're using. That are, if you've seen them blowing diesel plumes out the back of the trucks because they're 20 years old. This year they're going to make that decision, and a couple of the deciding vehicles are actually electric. I think that's certainly pushing things in the right direction. Packaging, I think is one of the challenges that people are starting to recognize in their homes. If you don't have a giant stack of corrugated boxes sitting by your front door or in your basement or by your curb every day, then you're probably not trying hard enough, because with all the home deliveries, that's become a real challenge. And so how do we reduce the impact of that packaging? Right sizing the packaging, so you don't get that computer cable in a giant box filled with bubble wrap or something. That's, I think, hugely impactful that we need to figure out. And honestly, unnecessary speed. if you don't need something the next day, then do you really have to accelerate that? And unnecessary speed means airplanes and faster impacts and more trips. Those all make a difference. So I think if we can impact those elements, then that will help push back the tide of what sustainability is. And I mean, we're always trying to do things. One thing I'll kind of call out is we just launched something as a result of the COVID situation. That's kind of a dual impact. Is post office picking up parcels from consumers' homes, or at least the sellers. That's something that we hadn't done before, and we built it into our technology so that when a seller creates a bunch of products, they press a button and it calls the post office to come and make that pickup. Because they were driving by their house anyway, why not save everybody a trip? You're safer from the social distancing, and you're also environmentally more responsible because you're not making any extra trips. So those are the type of things I think every organization has to look at and say, how can we do something that is good for sustainability and hopefully good for business and our consumers?
Lots of nods there from the panel as you were sharing those ideas, Roman. Jamin, your thoughts from an Alibaba perspective?
Yeah, and one of the things that I think about with sustainability and the current time that we're in is the goals of a great supply chain and sustainability are often pretty well aligned. One of which is it's better to fly full planes and have full trucks than it is to ship air around the world, which is very, very bad for logistics, but even worse for the environment because you're burning unnecessary fuel. So we look forward to helping both of those problems in any way that we can. And the big way to do that is with better data and better planning. So right now the pandemic has largely affected international air freight and capacity. Markus mentioned this a little bit ago. 2/3 of the air freight capacity in some lanes has just disappeared. And so price volatility has increased. The likelihood of having your shipment rolled has definitely increased. Some of the upstream supply chain in China is backlogged in terms of domestic trucking, and customs and border protection are struggling to keep up in certain areas because there's these big surges and then dead spots, and so it's hard for them to figure out how to keep the right amount of staff there. And so we think this is likely to continue for a little bit longer. And so we have a problem to solve as business owners and logistics people. And so in order to mitigate these things, the big thing, as I mentioned, is data and having access to a lot of options up front. And so I think for small business owners, having plan B providers and having, so if you just have a favorite provider you have a contract with, and then you only go to that provider, it can be very challenging right now if you don't have options B, C, and D. And so that's one thing, is finding additional options for your movements. And then secondly, planning things further out. One of the reasons this is necessary is because, if you're paying 5x for air, what you normally pay, it may not work for you to ship something by air right now. And so considering other means of transportation like ocean or ground, as Roman mentioned, for things that are less time sensitive, can really help solve that problem in the short term. And it's also less of an impact from a fuel consumption standpoint. So, a lot of this stuff comes on digital platforms. You'll hear me mention that. But there, what I'm excited about right now is the proliferation of so many new options. There's some great companies out there who are digitizing freight. They're making booking freight as easy as booking an airline ticket for a vacation. Maybe a little bit harder, but it's much better than it was. And so there are options there that I think people are starting to discover during this time that will help them manage freight capacity problems, pricing, timing and delivery issues, and hopefully will create a positive sustainability impact over time as well.
All right, maybe Patty, I can chip in here just from a slightly different angle. I mean, one thing we see actually during this COVID crisis is that the appreciation and the value that people see in transportation is dramatically increasing. Whilst in the past, transportation was merely a cost driver, suddenly it becomes a value driver. A simple way to see that, we're a big fans of NPA, Net Promoter Approach. The simple question, would you recommend us? And we can see a substantial change in the scores from before the crisis to within the crisis. So now with people really more seeing transportation as a value driver, I would also hope that, that the sustainability topics will be much easier going forward, and that people will also value a sustainable and not only a resilient supply chain much more than in the past. So maybe this crisis can actually create some hope. Of course, I know, Roy, people are forgetting fast. Maybe this is such a dramatic experience that the forgetting takes a bit longer this time, and then maybe we can really achieve something for sustainability.
Yeah, the opportunity here is tremendous. My program is meant to look at this holistically. So if we look at optimizing logistics, that's great. My question is, if we can produce a better product through design so that the material and/or end product is close to the consumer, localization of manufacture, we could, significantly reduce the amount of carbon that's being produced along the entire way. One of the professors in England came back and did a review of the simple little tennis ball, Wimbledon tennis ball, and tracked it that it went 50,000 miles from 13 different countries in order to create the product that's used in Wimbledon. The idea is, why don't we rethink the entire supply chain and then work the designers with all the knowledge that we have so that we start producing better products that are not only closer to the end consumer, but also with the thought of, how about, can we repair this product? Can we reuse this product? Can we actually take the components and remanufacture the same product? And then ultimately the product is built such that it can be recycled more effectively. We have an enormous opportunity in the supply chain field to look at a more holistic play and be able to say, how do we do this better next time? Not only just making more efficient at each level, but rethinking how this entire process is done. And that's all going to come from data. We need better understanding of the data from the beginning to the end, and then be able to connect those data points and then look at it more holistically. So there's a real opportunity to build sustainability into everything that we do.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not it shouldn't be sort of one individual bit. It needs to be built into the entire organization. I suppose that leads us on to another question. Roy, maybe you can continue with this, but from the perspective of companies that are looking to pivot to an e-com strategy now, or maybe even young companies that are emerging in the space, what are some of the common?
I think we lost you, Patty. But I know the question. I think I know the question you're trying to get to. I think some of the issues people have e-commerce, they think this is a front-end consumer e-commerce scenario, and that obviously is incredibly important to make it as easy as possible for the end customer to be able to find, order, and process that activity. But what I've seen in the past is that behind that e-commerce scene is, if they're building up a manual, paper-based process to try to make their supply chain work, they are heading into a world of hurt as things start to scale. So I beat the drum of holistic view of the supply chain, but I think the idea of the failing is that it's a front end issue or a last mile issue, when in actuality, it is important that we understand from the very beginning of this process, come in with a sustainability point of view, have data driven decisions that are going to make things more important, and then create that digital footprint so that we can track and be able to scale more effectively. And I mentioned earlier, this whole anti-fragile concept is letting the supply chain with the right data, not only one way, but feedback chains that allow the suppliers to be able to make on-time, real-time decisions about how they want to produce product, the types of suppliers that are available to that product, and therefore making those supply chains dynamic, flexible. And again, this concept of anti-fragile, which I think is just brilliant in terms of being able to use the entire supply chain and all the possibilities. Let me give you an example, which just killed me, is I'm sure you all saw on the news where these farmers that produced to a supply chain to go to restaurants, that the supply chain was so rigid that they had the inability to be able to move it. They actually had to dump the product, the milk and the vegetables, rather than trying to change their supply chain to be able to sell directly to home. I say, how rigid a system have we created to be able to pull pennies out of the process with the loss of flexibility, dynamic nature, sustainability? So I think the idea of trying to drive to that last penny, that literally get every possible squeeze out of the process, has held us open to such a rigid supply chain that we cause these huge delays. Another example, the stupid toilet paper example, that because most people were using those products at work, that's a different supply chain than the products that are used at home. And because companies couldn't switch from one to the other easily, all of a sudden you have this loss of availability inside the stores. But it's these types of things in terms of creating a dynamic living supply chain that I think is going to be our legacy in this process.
Yeah, flexibility and the ability to adapt to a change. Usually when things are too rehearsed, they don't change quickly. Jamin, your thoughts there, your tips for companies who are pivoting towards this e-commerce strategy.
Yeah, and I missed the the second half of what you're saying. You were asking about pitfalls or mistakes that they could face.
Yeah, correct. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it really depends on the type of business that you have. There is no, I mean, e-commerce is very broad, so it depends on the business. But for many existing offline B2B businesses, B2B tends to lag B2C businesses, and they're starting to migrate online, and that's great. But one of the big changes for them is that for B2B, large orders tend to be the norm. And moving to an e-commerce world can make it easier it offers the opportunity to capture demand in smaller quantities, and that can be attractive, but it's a pitfall because it can be much more complex due to the types of shipping involved. So if you're dealing now with less than container loads and less than truckloads, and it's a very, very different type of supply chain with its own complexities. And then on the cross-border side, I think knowing your customer becomes a real challenge, and it's very important that you understand identity, that you're able to trust the payments, that shipment visibility is happening, that clearance is happening well, that damaged goods become a bigger issue. So, it's important if you're venturing into cross-border to understand those things. But I think the biggest mistake that I see is businesses investing in supply chain visibility, but only going to the 10-yard line. And the problem with that is you are chasing the promise of all the benefits of supply chain visibility without getting the benefits of it, and you're chasing the benefits without and paying the price of doing that through integration and technology work. But it's a half measure if you haven't got partners who are also digital and are able to transmit the information that you want. And so, with customers expecting full visibility, reliable transportation, I think it's important to understand what it takes to provide a end-to-end visible solution for your end customers. And then I think lastly, so you can join Alibaba. There's lots of other platforms that can help with this, but digital commerce itself is not a panacea. And there are some specific challenges, I think, with international trade that businesses who are expanding into that need to be aware of. And so, one of which is just the trade war that we're in, is creating complexity at the border. And so it's important to understand that. It's also a whole new world of Incoterms, and many small businesses don't know what those mean. And who owns the goods at each point in the process? When do the risks transfer to me? What regulations do I need to face? So I think, I would be loath to say, get into e-commerce and digitize everything and everything will go well. You do have to be smart, and you have to be educated about how this new type of business is going to work differently from the business that you've been operating currently.
Certainly a different kettle of fish. Now, Roy, initially, but I think everyone on this panel has mentioned data and the importance of it thereof. A number of questions coming through from the audience around that. If we begin here with Markus, how important do you see data analytics being for retailers, marketplaces, logistics providers, all players in e-commerce as it continues to grow in the space beyond the current phase 2021 and the years subsequently? How important is data analytics to your operation in terms of making sure that ultimately everything's running smoothly and the customer is being delivered to in the correct way? You're just on mute, Markus, if you could quickly bounce off.
Sorry for that. Now I should be here. Now it should be there again.
There you are.
So
Yes,
so I can best talk about, of course, what does it mean for a logistics provider, and there clearly also, just like for most of the others, data is probably the new gold, because we were already touching in the beginning, how often does the bloody truck have to drive through the street, as a very simple question, and things like that. But we have a lot of new features that I talked about earlier, ODD, this on-demand delivery where your mobile phone becomes your remote control for your courier, or this topic about advanced duty collection. But just a simple fact like a mobile phone number, if that data point is not there, all the great new digitization opportunities go away, and that's a very simple topic. Or we have all these new fancy navigation algorithms and optimization opportunities, but if the address data quality is not good, and if there is something missing in there, all that is going away. So there's a ton of opportunities in this data, and it's on efficiency as well as on sustainability, as well as on customer experience. So I believe this data option is really at a smart spot where you can optimize all dimensions, be it cost, be it customer experience, or be it sustainability. But there is two big hurdles that I see. The one is data availability, getting the people to give you the data, and the other is a regulatory aspect, and sometimes I at least sense at some places, data protection is not about data protection, but about data prevention. And I think that is a big problem in the overall optimization stream, to really make sure that, number one, the data is available, but number two, you can also use it. Of course, use it in a proper way, use it in a protected way, but be able to use it, because we're giving away a million of opportunities by not always having that. In some instances, for example, in Germany, some of my large platforms, they have the phone number of the consumer, but by law, they're not allowed to give it to me, unless there is an explicit yes of the consumer. And that's a tick box easily forgotten in your shopping basket. And here we go, we're spending a fortune of money, we're wasting a lot of CO2, and we're ruining the customer experience. What a shame.
Roman, your thoughts on that, sort of different varying rules on data privacy and things in the US, but ultimately all heading towards the same place.
Yeah. So I think if we bring this down to the consumer, I know personally that as soon as they started putting calories on some of these boxes, it's my entire understanding of the value of a particular product. And I think the buyer in the B2B environment, if they were given more information in terms of the total cost of these structures, that there would be a significant shift in the value creation. So buyers and CPOs in the past all were driven. Their number one goal is cost savings, which just created really bad decisions to try to get every nickel out of every single product and every single supplier, and therefore forcing suppliers to do things that were cost driven at the currency level versus holistic cost driven. So the idea here is that if you start to show people what the carbon footprint in terms of that data activity, the logistics strain, The McKinsey report came out and said that 90% of our environmental impact is coming from the supply chain, meaning if we could create a more efficient supply chain using data all along the way so that the consumer can actually make decisions based upon its carbon level, its total cost structure, its utilization of labor, its environmental impact, all of those things would make changes and decisions that would allow us to be able to create better products, to be able to create products that are more environmentally sensitive, that reduce the forced labor inside of our supply chain, and be able to create environments that are going to make this whole world more sustainable at a cost structure that's actually less than we're dealing with today. So I think the loss of data or the lack of data is actually forcing people to make wrong decisions on wrong data points, and that's got to change. We've got to improve that along the entire structure.
And Roman, your thoughts there?
Sure. I mean, I think all the best products started with the consumer, the ultimate user of it, and applying simplicity so that you take something really complicated and make it look very easy. So data is obviously the solution for a lot of that. And I think what's really changed over the last certainly 5 years is the comparisons that consumers make, the unfair comparisons that they make. They're not going to compare your parcel delivery to how difficult it is to get something over. They're going to compare it to Uber and saying, hey, if I can watch the Uber driver coming down the street, to pick me up, or my Uber Eats where my hamburger is coming to my house, why can't I see my parcel moving down the street so I know exactly where it is? Or my refrigerator is going to be delivered to my house at 1 o'clock rather than getting a message that says the delivery is going to happen sometime between 10 and 6 tomorrow. Those are kind of the data problems that we have to get better at, and simplifying the consumer. They don't care how you do it. They just care the fact that I've seen it happen in another industry, so why can't we do it here? And so if we can get data to work harder on those elements, now that we have access to a lot of it, and applying to industries that maybe were traditionally much more analog, I think that's where we're going to see some of the big changes and improvements to more successful organizations.
Perfect. Well, we're coming up to the end of the hour now. So firstly, thanks very much for all your questions from the audience. I hope we haven't got to all of them, but I imagine at this time, questions are the other gold that people are dealing in as uncertainty sort of reigns supreme. But I think maybe in the interest of rounding this out, then one final question for your closing thoughts, and maybe we'll start with yourself, Jamin. Obviously, in the fullness of time, from disruption and crisis come opportunities. We've touched on quite a few areas of if you like, the bigger picture today. But what lessons should companies learn from this COVID-19 outbreak, and how can they take that into their strategies to maximize e-commerce in their businesses and potentially other areas as well in a post flashpoint of the virus world where we are now?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think I hope that the main thing people take away from this difficult period is how many new options there are to do trade differently. I think we're all working from home and doing meetings on Zoom or GoToMeeting, and we discovered that we can actually operate that way, and that's great news. But I think that's true on the business side as well. I don't think anyone would have chosen for this to happen, but given that it has, I'm convinced that changes to digitization of how we do business, digitizing the supply chain, finding tools to, for trade finance that you didn't know about, finding trade partners who can do business end to end electronically. I think those are the types of things that will stick from this and will help people, especially the most resilient businesses to prosper. And I think related to that is they will start to require trading partners throughout their supply chain and their ecosystem to do the same. So I think it's going to accelerate the rate of change for people to adopt digital technologies and be more data driven and less, less face-to-face. And then I think lastly, there's two things I think people need to take away from this. One is monitoring the market, it's been, I think, a learning experience for many people to understand how important it is to see ahead in the freight markets, and there's more opportunity to do that, I think, now than ever. There are some great companies out there who are putting digital research on e-commerce and supply chain at your fingertips. You don't need to have a $500 an hour consultant come in. You can buy it in 5 minutes. What's the capacity at the ports? How much should you be paying per kilo, et cetera? So things like that. And then secondly and lastly is having a plan B. I think that's a pretty big takeaway from this, is what happens when your existing supply chain doesn't work the way it's supposed to. And do you really want to be negotiating a bunch of new contracts in the middle of a crisis? Probably not. So knowing what's out there, learning how to shift your business into something new is very, very important lesson.
Roy, your thoughts on the biggest takeaways for people?
Well, I think everyone has to understand that there is no post-virus world. That if you look at the history of viruses, and not only viruses, but wildfires and tsunamis and all these other things that are happening and impacting our supply chains, that we have to be able to understand that this is a part of living. This is a part of the world as we know it, and that we as a supply chain participant have to be much more flexible in this structure. We have to have multiple opportunities to be able to meet our requirements effectively, and we have to know how what we do is impacting that element of the supply chain. So I think, for example, there's no way the governments can sustain just shutting everything down every couple of years. There's just not enough money in the world, or maybe there is, they just create it. I'm not sure of that concept. You have to get an economist to help us out there. But that's not sustainable as a decision point. So we have to, as an entity, as a whole world, be able to look at this and say, how do we manage through these processes? How do we make mitigating changes? How do we mitigate risk going forward? Because this is not a once and done. This is something that's going to be a part of our life throughout, ongoing.
Roman, some quick thoughts from yourself?
Sure. Well, I think I like what Jamin had said. It's ultimately things will fail. You need to have a plan B, a plan C, and be prepared to react quickly. Optimization is usually when you can do one thing really, really well and 100% focus on it. I don't think that's the new normal anymore. I think we're going to have to invest a lot more in flexibility. And flexibility is a little more expensive, but ultimately, as we've seen now, this is where it pays off to have that flexibility. Also, don't overcommit. Communicating with your customers, whether they're businesses or end consumers, has to be critical to them. Trust is everything, and they need to know what is happening. Nothing is worse than just radio silence. So have systems in place where you can tell your customers if something's going to be late, then let them know. If you know that delivery times are now changed, tell them before they make their purchase, not afterwards, because they're going to come back resentful if you give them news after the fact when you could have told them things beforehand. So those are kind of my key things that I think are critical for this on new normal.
Certainly, proactivity rather than reactivity. Markus, the last minute and the final word honor falls to yourself.
Thank you very much. So, my headline would be resilience. And, in the space of e-commerce, I think 3 things that I would give people on, think about omni-channel strategy. So don't just rely on one channel, just be present everywhere so you're prepared for different situations. Discover new and unexpected target groups. I think, this crisis gives a big digitization boost. So there's suddenly new target groups you can conquer. And on the internal side, think about new work. I think, the working environment and the way your company will internally operate and work will be very different. So those would be the 3 pieces that I would be thinking about, if I would be sitting back and, having 5 minutes of peacetime.
Perfect. Nice and concise. Well, look, that's all the time we have for today, gentlemen. Thank you so much for sharing all your thoughts and sharing your time, Markus, Jamin, Roman, and Roy. It's greatly appreciated. I'm sure the audience will agree. Thank you very much as well to the audience for joining in, for listening to this as part of our our supply chain risk series. There will be more on the way from EFT by Reuters events, so keep an ear out for that. But until then, many thanks, be safe, and goodbye.